The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine black Tesla Model 3 as Marcus Williams drove through downtown. The 17-year-old's hands rested confidently on the steering wheel, his graduation ring catching the light as he made a careful turn at the intersection. The car had been a surprise gift from his parents just 2 days ago, a reward for graduating as valedictorian from Hamilton High School. Marcus had spent hours learning every feature of the vehicle, studying the manual until late into the night. His father, State Attorney David Williams, had taught him exactly how to behave if he ever got pulled over. Hands visible, movements slow, documents ready. It shouldn't be necessary, his father had said with a tight smile, but it's the world we live in. As Marcus cruised down Madison Avenue, he didn't notice the police cruiser that had begun following him 3 blocks back. Inside that cruiser, Officer James Peterson sat with his eyes fixed on the Tesla, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. In his 15 years on the force, he developed what he called a sixth sense about suspicious vehicles. To him, a young black man in an expensive car set off all kinds of red flags. The Tesla's turn signal blinked as Marcus prepared to turn onto Oak Street. Officer Peterson had seen enough. He flipped on his lights, and the siren chirped twice. Marcus's heart sank as he checked his rearview mirror. He'd been doing everything right, driving exactly at the speed limit, making complete stops, using his signals. But here he was, being pulled over anyway. Following his father's instructions, Marcus pulled over smoothly, positioning the car in a well-lit area near a coffee shop where several people were sitting outside. He turned off the engine, placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and took a deep breath. His wallet was in his back pocket, and the car's documents were in the glove compartment, but he knew better than to reach for either until asked. Officer Peterson approached the driver's side window, his hand resting casually on his holster, a detail that didn't escape Marcus's notice. The officer's face was set in a stern expression as he shone his flashlight directly into the car, even though it was still daylight. "License and registration," Officer Peterson barked, not bothering with any preliminary greeting. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied politely, keeping his voice steady. "My license is in my back pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." The officer nodded curtly, his flashlight beam following Marcus's every movement. In the coffee shop window, several customers had turned to watch the scene unfold. A few had already taken out their phones. Marcus handed over his license and registration with steady hands. The documents were pristine. The registration was barely 2 days old, and his license still had that new card shine to it. Officer Peterson studied them with obvious skepticism. "This your car?" the officer asked, his tone making it clear he didn't believe it could be. "Yes, sir. It was a graduation gift from my parents." Officer Peterson's eyebrows rose. "A mighty expensive graduation gift. Where you go to school?" "I just graduated from Hamilton High School, sir. I was valedictorian." Marcus kept his voice level, even as he felt his pulse quickening. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Peterson commanded suddenly. "May I ask why, sir? Have I done something wrong?" "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his hand tightening on his holster. "We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area." Marcus felt a familiar mix of frustration and fear rising in his chest. This was exactly what his father had warned him about, exactly what they'd practiced for. Still keeping his movements slow and deliberate, he unbuckled his seatbelt. Outside the coffee shop, more people had gathered to watch. Several phones were now recording the interaction. Among the onlookers was Mrs. Chen, Marcus's former math teacher, who had immediately recognized her star student. She pulled out her phone, but instead of recording, she started typing a message to someone she knew needed to be informed about this situation. As Marcus carefully stepped out of his car, he stood tall and dignified, just as his father had taught him. He was wearing his Hamilton High School letterman jacket, his valedictorian medals still pinned to the lapel. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just 2 days ago, he'd been giving a graduation speech about progress and equality, and now here he was, living proof of how far they still had to go. Officer Peterson's next words would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the entire police department to its core, though neither of them knew it yet. "Face the car and put your hands on the hood," Officer Peterson commanded, his voice carrying across the now quiet street. Marcus complied, feeling the warm metal beneath his palms. The Tesla's black surface reflected his face, and he forced himself to maintain his composure. Behind them, the crowd outside the coffee shop had grown larger. Mrs. Chen, Marcus's former math teacher, was now on the phone, speaking quickly and quietly. Several other bystanders had their phones raised, recording everything. The evening sun cast long shadows across the scene, making it look like a stage drama unfolding in real time. "Sir," Marcus said calmly, "I can prove this is my car. There's a video of my parents giving it to me at my graduation party. It's right here on my phone." "Did I say you could speak?" Officer Peterson snapped, moving closer. "You expect me to believe a kid like you can afford a Tesla? These cars cost more than most houses around here." The officer began a rough pat-down, checking Marcus's pockets. He pulled out the boy's phone, wallet, and car keys, placing them on the hood of the car. When he opened the wallet, he found not only Marcus's driver's license, but also his student ID card showing him as class valedictorian, several academic achievement awards, and a photo of him with his parents at his graduation. Officer Peterson ignored these items. Instead, he picked up Marcus's phone, now buzzing with incoming messages. The screen showed a text from Dad with the preview reading, "Son, are you okay? Mrs. Chen just called. Looks like you're trying to get your story straight with someone," the officer said, his tone accusatory. He dropped the phone back onto the hood with a clatter. A second police car pulled up, lights flashing. Officer Sarah Martinez stepped out, taking in the scene before her. She had worked with Peterson before and knew his reputation for making questionable stops. Her eyes moved from Marcus's Letterman jacket to the growing crowd of witnesses. "What's the situation, Peterson?" she asked, approaching cautiously. "Possible grand theft auto," Peterson replied. "Subject claims the car was a gift, but you know how these stories go." Officer Martinez noticed the academic medals on Marcus's jacket and the wallet contents spread across the car's hood. Something wasn't adding up. She picked up Marcus's student ID and examined it closely. "Hamilton High valedictorian?" she asked Marcus directly. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied respectfully. "I just graduated 2 days ago. This car was a gift from my parents. My father is—" "I said quiet," Peterson interrupted, taking a step closer to Marcus. "Martinez, check the car. These models are hot items for theft right now." Officer Martinez walked around the Tesla, noting the fresh registration papers visible through the windshield. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen had finally gotten through to someone important. She spoke urgently into her phone. "Yes, Mr. Williams, they haven't spread out on the hood of the car right now. Your son is being perfectly polite. But this officer, you need to get here quickly." The situation was getting more tense by the minute. More people had gathered, and the murmurs from the crowd were growing louder. Someone in the crowd shouted, "He's just a kid. Leave him alone." Peterson's face reddened at the crowd's reaction. "Everyone stay back," he shouted. "This is a police investigation." Marcus remained still, his hands on the hood, but his mind was racing. He knew his father would be on his way now. He just had to stay calm and follow the protocol they had practiced. Still, he couldn't help but notice how Officer Martinez kept looking at his student ID and then at him, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Peterson," Martinez said quietly, "I think we should double-check." "I've seen this trick before." Peterson cut her off. "Nice car, fake ID, sob story about it being a gift, classic setup." Just then, Marcus's phone buzzed again on the hood of the car. The screen lit up with another message from his father. "5 minutes away. Keep calm. Remember what we practiced." Officer Peterson reached for his handcuffs, the metal gleaming in the evening light. The crowd's murmurs turned to protests. Mrs. Chen was now recording too, her hands shaking but her phone steady. Officer Martinez took a step forward, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was escalating. What happened next would be played on every local news station by morning, but for now, the tension in the air was electric as Officer Peterson made a decision that would change his career forever. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists as Officer Peterson roughly pulled his arms behind his back. The crowd's angry voices grew louder, but Peterson seemed to take their reaction as confirmation that he was doing something right. Officer Martinez stood to the side, her face showing clear discomfort with the situation. "You have the right to remain silent," Peterson began reciting the Miranda rights, his voice carrying across the now packed sidewalk. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Mrs. Chen pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her phone still recording. This is absolutely ridiculous, she called out. I've known Marcus for 4 years. He's the brightest student I've ever taught. Officer Peterson ignored her, continuing with the rights as he guided Marcus toward the police car. Marcus walked with his head held high, remembering his father's words. If the worst happens, stay dignified. Let them see your strength, not your fear. Officer Martinez approached her partner, speaking in a low voice. Peterson, look at his school ID again. Something's not right here. Maybe we should verify. You're too soft, Martinez. Peterson cut her off. Rich car, wrong neighborhood, wrong kid. Do the math. Just then, a sleek black SUV with government plates came screeching around the corner. It pulled up behind the police cars, its tires squealing slightly on the asphalt. The crowd turned to look, many still recording with their phones. Marcus, now standing beside the police car, felt a small smile form on his lips. He knew that vehicle. He knew what was about to happen. State Attorney David Williams stepped out of the SUV, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit despite the late hour. His presence commanded immediate attention, and several people in the crowd gasped in recognition. Behind him, 2 assistant attorneys emerged, carrying briefcases. Officer Peterson, the state attorney's voice boomed across the street. I suggest you remove those handcuffs from my son immediately. The color drained from Peterson's face. He froze, one hand still on Marcus's arm. Officer Martinez's eyes widened as she finally understood why the student ID had seemed so familiar. She had seen the state attorney's photo countless times at the precinct. Your son, Peterson stammered, his confidence evaporating. Marcus Williams, David Williams said, walking closer, valedictorian of Hamilton High School, recipient of a full scholarship to Yale University, and yes, my son, the young man you just arrested for driving his graduation present. The crowd had fallen completely silent, phone still recording as the scene unfolded. Mrs. Chen had a satisfied smile on her face as she continued to document everything. I was just following protocol. Peterson tried to explain, but his voice was weak. Protocol. State Attorney Williams raised an eyebrow. Please explain which protocol involves arresting a minor without cause, ignoring valid identification, and dismissing proof of ownership. He turned to Officer Martinez. Remove those handcuffs, please. Martinez quickly stepped forward, hands slightly shaking as she unlocked the handcuffs. Marcus rubbed his wrists but maintained his composure, just as he'd been taught. Dad, Marcus said quietly, everything's on their body cameras. State Attorney Williams nodded. Indeed it is, son. He turned to address both officers. I want those cameras secured immediately. We'll be reviewing every second of footage from the moment you began following my son's car. Peterson's face had turned ashen. His body camera suddenly felt very heavy on his chest. Behind him, several senior officers were now arriving at the scene, likely alerted by dispatch about the state attorney's presence. Mr. Williams, Officer Martinez stepped forward. I want to apologize. Save it for the official investigation, Williams interrupted firmly but not unkindly. Right now, I'm taking my son home, but tomorrow morning, we're going to have a very long conversation about racial profiling in this department. As Marcus collected his belongings from the hood of his Tesla, the crowd began to applaud. Mrs. Chen stepped forward to give him a quick hug. I knew your father would fix this, she whispered. Marcus got back into his car, his father's SUV pulling in behind him to escort him home. As they drove away, Officer Peterson stood rooted to the spot, watching his career crumble before his eyes. The night wasn't over yet, but the real storm would begin tomorrow morning at the precinct. Behind him, Martinez was already on her radio, calling in what had happened to their superior officers. The crowd slowly dispersed, their phones filled with footage that would soon be all over social media. This incident would change not just Peterson's life, but the entire department's approach to traffic stops. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Peterson sat at his desk, filling out what he knew might be his last police report. It was 9 p.m., but the station was unusually active. News of what had happened with the state attorney's son had spread like wildfire through the department. Captain Roberts stood in his office, phone pressed to his ear, face growing redder by the minute. Through the glass walls, everyone could see him pacing back and forth. The blinds were open, and officers walking past could catch snippets of his conversation. "Yes, sir. No, sir. I understand the severity. Yes, the body camera footage is secured." At the front desk, Officer Martinez was giving her statement to Internal Affairs. Her hands wrapped around a paper cup of cold coffee as she described everything she had witnessed. "I tried to tell him something wasn't right," she explained to the investigators. "The kid's ID, his Letterman jacket, the new car registration, it all checked out." The station doors swung open, and a hush fell over the room. State Attorney David Williams walked in, followed by two members of his legal team. He had changed from his suit into more casual clothing, but his presence was no less commanding. Officers scrambled to look busy, avoiding eye contact. Captain Roberts rushed out of his office. "Mr. Williams, we've been expecting you. Please, come this way." "Actually," Williams said, his voice carrying across the quiet room, "I think we'll need your largest conference room. This isn't just about my son anymore." He turned to address the whole station. "This is about every young person who's been pulled over for driving while black in this city." Peterson sank lower in his chair, trying to become invisible. But Williams had already spotted him. "Officer Peterson, you'll be joining us too." The large conference room quickly filled up. Internal Affairs investigators sat on one side, their laptops open. Captain Roberts and 3 senior officers occupied another side. Williams and his legal team took their positions at the head of the table. Peterson sat alone on the fourth side, looking small in his uniform. "Play the footage," Williams instructed. On the large screen mounted on the wall, the body camera video began to play. Everyone watched in silence as Peterson's entire interaction with Marcus unfolded. The racial profiling was obvious, from the moment Peterson began following the Tesla without cause, through his aggressive questioning, to the unjustified arrest. When the video ended, Williams stood up. "This isn't just about one officer's poor judgment," he said, looking around the room. "This is about a system that made Officer Peterson think his actions would be acceptable." He pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. "In this folder, I have statistics from the last 5 years. Traffic stops, arrests, and complaints sorted by race. The numbers tell a very clear story." He paused, letting his words sink in. "A story that ends today." Peterson finally found his voice. "Sir, I want to apologize. I didn't know." "That's precisely the problem," Williams interrupted. "You didn't know Marcus was my son, so you thought it was okay to treat him like a criminal. How many other young men have you treated the same way, Officer Peterson? Men who didn't have a state attorney for a father." Captain Roberts cleared his throat. "What are you proposing, Mr. Williams?" "Complete departmental overhaul," Williams replied without hesitation. "New training protocols, regular bias assessments, community oversight boards, and body camera reviews. Either we fix this systematically, or I take everything I have to the media." The Internal Affairs investigators were typing frantically, documenting every word. Peterson stared at his hands, his career flashing before his eyes. "As for Officer Peterson," Williams continued, "I'm not calling for his badge, yet." Everyone looked up in surprise. "Instead, I want him to be part of the solution. Community service, bias training, and regular meetings with community leaders. Sometimes, the best advocates for change are those who've seen their own prejudices clearly for the first time." The meeting continued late into the night. Outside the conference room, officers gathered in small groups, discussing the changes that were coming. Some looked worried, others relieved. At the front desk, a photo of Marcus at his graduation ceremony still lay where Martinez had placed it earlier, a reminder that behind every traffic stop was a human being with a story. The station's old ways were ending, and a new chapter was beginning. Whether they were ready or not, change was coming to the department, and it was coming fast. The morning sun had barely risen when the local news vans began gathering outside the police station. Reporters clutched their coffee cups, checking their phones constantly for updates. The video of Marcus's arrest had gone viral overnight, with millions of views across social media platforms. Inside her small apartment, Mrs. Chen watched the morning news while preparing for school. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since last night. News channels wanted to interview her, and her video of the incident had been shared thousands of times. She smiled, remembering Marcus's dignity throughout the ordeal. The TV anchor's voice filled her living room. Breaking news. Video shows local police officer arresting the son of State Attorney David Williams in what appears to be a clear case of racial profiling. The 17-year-old honors student was driving a graduation gift when, at the Williams household, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through hundreds of supportive messages on his phone. His mother, Diana Williams, a well-known civil rights attorney herself, was already dressed for court and reviewing the incident reports. "You handled it perfectly, honey," she said, reaching over to squeeze her son's hand. "Just like we practiced. But it breaks my heart that we had to practice at all." Marcus nodded, then looked up as his father walked into the kitchen, already on the phone. State Attorney Williams was in full crisis management mode. "Yes, Governor, I understand your concern," he said into the phone. "No, this isn't just about my son. This is about systematic change. Yes, I'll be holding a press conference at 10 a.m. Meanwhile, at Officer Peterson's small house, he sat on his couch, still in his uniform from yesterday. He hadn't slept all night. His TV showed his own face from the body camera footage, his voice harsh and prejudiced. His phone kept ringing, mostly reporters, but also his mother, who had called 5 times after seeing him on the morning news. "James Peterson," his mother had said in her last voicemail, "I didn't raise you to judge people like this. You need to make this right." Back at the police station, Captain Roberts was dealing with a crisis. The mayor's office had called 3 times already. The police union representatives were in his office, along with internal affairs investigators and the department's public relations team. "This is a nightmare," the PR director said, spreading out the morning newspapers. Every front page showed the same story. One headline read, "State Attorney's son racially profiled. A wake-up call for police reform." Officer Martinez walked into the station for her shift, pushing through the crowd of reporters. Their questions followed her. "Officer, did you witness the arrest? Was this normal behavior for Officer Peterson? How widespread is racial profiling in the department?" At exactly 10 a.m., State Attorney Williams stepped up to a podium outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed as Marcus stood beside him, still wearing his Letterman jacket. The crowd of reporters fell silent as Williams began to speak. "Yesterday, my son experienced what too many young men of color face every day," he began, his voice strong and clear. "The only difference is that my position allowed me to do something about it. Today, that changes." He held up a thick document. "This is a comprehensive police reform proposal that I've been working on for months. Yesterday's incident only confirms its necessity. We're calling for mandatory bias training, community oversight boards, and a complete overhaul of traffic stop protocols." In the crowd, Officer Peterson stood in civilian clothes, listening. He had been ordered to attend by Captain Roberts. As he heard the state attorney's words, something shifted in his understanding. He saw Marcus standing tall beside his father, and for the first time, he saw not a stereotype, but a young man, someone's son, someone's student, someone's friend. Mrs. Chen arrived at the press conference during her lunch break, still wearing her teacher's badge. She made her way through the crowd to stand near Marcus, giving him an encouraging smile. The cameras continued to roll as State Attorney Williams outlined his plans for reform. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It had become a catalyst for change, a moment that would reshape the entire police department. As the press conference continued, social media exploded with new hashtags. #JusticeForMarcus, #DrivingWhileBlack, #PoliceReformo. The story had struck a nerve, and it was clear that this was just the beginning of a much larger conversation about justice, equality, and change. 1 week after the incident, Officer Peterson sat nervously in a community center meeting room. Around him, 30 teenagers from local high schools, including Marcus, waited for the session to begin. This was part of his rehabilitation program, facing the community he had wronged. Marcus watched as Peterson wiped sweat from his forehead. The officer looked different in casual clothes, smaller somehow, more human. Mrs. Chen sat beside Marcus, having volunteered to moderate the session. She had become something of a local hero after her video went viral. Officer Peterson, Mrs. Chen began, her voice gentle but firm. Would you like to start by sharing your thoughts with these students? Peterson stood up slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the podium. The room fell silent. Several students had their phones out, recording. My name is James Peterson, he began, his voice rough with emotion. 1 week ago, I did something terrible. I stopped a young man for no reason except the color of his skin and the car he was driving. He paused, looking directly at Marcus. I was wrong. In the back of the room, State Attorney Williams stood quietly, watching. His police reform proposal was already gaining support from city council members, but he knew real change started with conversations like this. I've been a police officer for 15 years, Peterson continued. And until last week, I thought I was one of the good ones. But watching my body camera footage, his voice cracked. I saw myself through your eyes, and I didn't like what I saw. A young girl raised her hand. How many other kids have you stopped like that? Kids who didn't have important parents to help them? Peterson's face flushed with shame. Too many, he admitted. I spent the past week reviewing all my traffic stops. The pattern is clear, and it's inexcusable. At the police station across town, Officer Martinez was leading a new training session. On the screen behind her, dash cam footage played from various traffic stops, including Marcus's incident. This is how not to handle a situation, she explained to the room full of officers. But more importantly, this is how bias turns into discrimination, even when we don't realize it's happening. Back at the community center, Marcus stood up to speak. The room grew even quieter. Officer Peterson, he said, my father taught me how to handle police stops when I was 12 years old. We practiced in our garage, where to put my hands, how to speak, when to move. No child should have to rehearse staying alive. Tears formed in Peterson's eyes. In the back of the room, State Attorney Williams watched his son with pride. But, Marcus continued, my father also taught me about forgiveness and change. That's why I'm here today. Not to shame you, but to help build something better. Mrs. Chen then divided the room into small groups. Police officers who had volunteered for the program sat with students, listening to their experiences. Stories flowed freely, tales of fear, misunderstanding, and hope for change. Peterson found himself in a group with Marcus and 3 other students. They shared their stories of being profiled, of living with constant anxiety during traffic stops. For the first time, Peterson truly listened. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Diana Williams, Marcus's mother, was presenting new legislation to the city council. The bill would require regular bias training, community engagement programs, and strict oversight of traffic stop patterns. My son's experience opened our eyes, she told the council members, but this isn't about him. It's about every child who doesn't have a state attorney for a father. Back at the community center, the session was ending. Peterson approached Marcus privately. I know sorry isn't enough, he said quietly, but I want you to know that you've changed me. Changed how I see things. Marcus nodded, extending his hand. It's not just about change, Officer Peterson. It's about making sure that change lasts. As people filed out of the community center, State Attorney Williams watched his son talking with other students. The incident had been painful, but it had sparked something powerful. Real conversations were happening. Real changes were beginning. Mrs. Chen gathered her things, smiling at the sight of former adversaries now talking like people who understood each other. She knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, but at least they had taken the first steps together. Outside, the sun was setting over the city. It was the same city as before, but something was different now. Change was in the air, and it had started with one traffic stop, one brave young man, and one officer learning to see through new eyes. 3 months after the incident, Marcus stood at the front of a packed auditorium at police headquarters. Behind him, a large screen showed statistics and graphs. At 17, he had become the youngest member of the newly formed Police Community Relations Board, and today was his first major presentation. In the past 3 months, Marcus explained, pointing to the screen, traffic stop complaints have dropped by 60%. But more importantly, community trust has begun to rise. His voice was confident, carrying across the room filled with officers, city officials, and community members. Officer Peterson sat in the front row, wearing his uniform again. After completing intensive bias training and working closely with the community program, he had been reinstated to active duty. But he was different now. His new role focused on training other officers about bias awareness and community relations. Officer Peterson, Marcus said, gesturing to him, "Would you like to share your experience with the new training program?" Peterson stood up, facing his fellow officers. 3 months ago, I was the problem, he began honestly. Today, I'm part of the solution. Every traffic stop I make now is recorded and reviewed. Every interaction is a chance to prove that change is possible. In the audience, Mrs. Chen smiled proudly. Her classroom had become a weekly meeting spot for the Youth Police Dialogue program she had started with Marcus. The program had already spread to 3 other high schools in the city. State Attorney Williams sat with the police chief, both men nodding as they reviewed the progress reports. The reforms they had implemented were becoming a model for other cities. Just last week, 2 other state attorneys had visited to learn about their program. Next month, Marcus continued his presentation. We're launching a new app. It allows drivers to immediately access their rights during traffic stops and automatically starts recording when activated. He demonstrated the app on the screen. This isn't about catching bad officers, it's about protecting everyone, both officers and citizens. Officer Martinez, now promoted to sergeant, stood up to speak. The app also lets officers know that they're being recorded, she explained. It's about transparency on both sides. When everyone knows they're being watched, everyone behaves better. In the back of the room, Diana Williams watched her son with tears of pride in her eyes. Next to her sat Marcus's younger sister, Sophia, recording everything on her phone. The video would later be shared as part of their ongoing documentation of the changes happening in their city. After the presentation, Peterson approached Marcus. "Yale starts next month, right?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "Yes, but I'll be back every month for the board meetings. This work is too important to stop." Peterson smiled. "You know, my daughter is in middle school now. Last week, she told me she wants to be a lawyer like your parents. She said she wants to help make things fair for everyone." The local news crew, who had been filming the presentation, captured this moment between Marcus and Peterson. Their story had become a symbol of how conflict could lead to positive change when handled with wisdom and compassion. Later that evening, at a local restaurant, the Williams family celebrated with Mrs. Chen and several board members. Marcus's phone kept buzzing with messages from other cities asking about their reform program. "Did you ever think," Mrs. Chen asked State Attorney Williams, "that one traffic stop would lead to all this?" Williams shook his head. "No, but I always knew Marcus would do something special. He just needed the right moment." Marcus looked around the table at the unlikely group gathered there, his parents, his former teacher, police officers, and community leaders. 3 months ago, they had been on opposite sides. Now they were working together for change. "The real test," Marcus said, "will be keeping this going after I leave for college." "Don't worry," Peterson assured him. "We're not going back to the old ways. Too many people are watching now. Too many people care." Outside the restaurant, a police car drove past with its lights on. Nobody at the table tensed up or worried. That perhaps was the biggest change of all, the slow return of trust between the police and their community. As the evening ended, Marcus checked his presentation notes for tomorrow. He would be speaking at another police department in a neighboring city. The ripple effect of that one traffic stop was still spreading, changing lives far beyond their own city limits. The Yale University auditorium was packed to capacity. Marcus Williams, now 18 and finishing his freshman year, stood at the podium addressing a national conference on police reform. Behind him, a large screen showed familiar faces: Officer Peterson, Mrs. Chen, and his father, all smiling through a video call. "1 year ago," Marcus began, his voice strong and clear, "I was just a kid with a new car. Today, I'm speaking to police departments across the country about our success story. But this isn't my story alone. It belongs to everyone who helped turn a moment of injustice into a movement for change." In the audience, police chiefs from 50 different cities took notes. Their departments had all seen the viral video of Marcus's arrest, but more importantly, they'd seen the remarkable changes that followed in his city. Back home, Officer Peterson was sitting in his patrol car, watching Marcus's speech on his phone during his break. His police badge now had a new addition, a small pin identifying him as a community relations officer. His daughter sat beside him in the car, proudly wearing her future lawyer t-shirt. "Your friend Marcus is really changing things, Dad," she said, watching the speech. Peterson smiled. "He changed me first," he replied quietly. At Hamilton High School, Mrs. Chen's classroom had become famous. The walls were covered with news articles and photos documenting their city's transformation. A framed picture showed Marcus and Officer Peterson speaking together at last month's graduation ceremony, where they had both been invited as keynote speakers. State Attorney Williams watched his son's speech from his office, where he was meeting with officials from the Department of Justice. Their city's reform program was being considered as a model for national implementation. "Your son," one official commented, "has done more for police reform than decades of legislation." "Marcus just showed us the way," Williams replied. "The real change happened because everyone was ready to listen and learn." In the police station, Officer Martinez, now Lieutenant Martinez, was conducting her weekly review of traffic stop data. The numbers told a beautiful story: complaints down by 80%, community satisfaction up by 70%, and most importantly, 0 incidents of racial profiling in the past 6 months. On her desk sat a copy of the manual she and Peterson had written together, From Bias to Bridge Building, a new approach to community policing. It was now required reading at the police academy. Back at Yale, Marcus was concluding his speech. "The app we created has been downloaded 2 million times, he announced. But the real success isn't in the numbers, it's in the stories. Officers and citizens learning to trust each other again. Communities healing. People changing." The video feed showed Peterson nodding in agreement. He was scheduled to speak at next month's Police Academy graduation. His speech would focus on his personal journey from being part of the problem to becoming part of the solution. After the conference, Marcus video called his mother. Diana Williams was in court, where she had just won another case supporting police reform in a neighboring state. "Mom," he said excitedly, 5 more states want to implement our program." That evening, back in their hometown, a special ceremony was taking place. The community center where everything had started was being renamed. The Williams-Peterson Center for Community Unity. It seemed impossible that the two names would ever be joined together. That was the point, to show that change was always possible. Mrs. Chen cut the ribbon at the ceremony. "1 year ago," she told the crowd, "I recorded a video of injustice. Today, I'm recording history." As the ceremony ended, Officer Peterson's daughter approached Marcus, who was home for the event. "Because of you and my dad," she said, "I know police officers can be good people who sometimes make mistakes, and mistakes can be fixed if people are willing to learn." Marcus smiled, remembering the scared teenager he'd been a year ago. Now he was helping shape national policy, speaking at conferences, and watching real change happen. But more importantly, he was seeing how one moment, handled with dignity and wisdom, could transform an entire community. The sun set over their city, and patrol cars drove peacefully through the streets. Inside them, officers wearing body cameras and carrying new training certificates went about their duties. On their dashboards, Marcus's app glowed softly, a constant reminder that transparency and trust go hand in hand. The truth had come to light 1 year ago, but the light had only grown stronger since then, spreading hope and change far beyond one traffic stop, one officer, and one brave young man.